welcome to the NFL First Look, where we're going to go over a few things today. First impressions, targets, touches, routes, and really just break down each position and get us really ramped up for Week 9. But first, go ahead and introduce my co-host, Sal Vitri. Sal, good morning, man. How are you?
Doing well. Yeah, glad to have you here on a Tuesday. My Saturday co-host of this here on a Tuesday, so it's fun. We'll start the week like you said, but we'll look over some stuff. Lots of injuries to always go over, but there's going to be some real impactful ones that are going to alter this slate. Something we haven't probably seen this year in terms of a really cheap running back that might just end up being and should probably end up being the chalk by the end of the week. And yeah, I'm excited to break it all down.
Absolutely, man, and I'm glad to be here. You know, sometimes you gotta be like a bench player where you just get your number called. You got to come into the game. So
a utility guy.
Yeah, I'm a little utility.
You hit for power too.
I'm like Marwan Gonzalez, right?
There we go.
You can just play every position. Nah, but you guys, welcome, and we appreciate you guys for joining us here early this morning. What we're going to do first is we're going to go over some injuries first, and we're going to go on position by position for Week 9 of the main slate. So, Sal, I guess we'll kick it off first with the injuries. Any significant injuries right now you want to point out first that maybe we should definitely keep an eye on this week for Week 9?
Yeah, so the biggest injury to be watching this week is what happened last night with James Conner. James Conner had a great game going, just huge as many running backs have against Miami. And he comes out of that game, and now they're fearful that he might miss the entire season with potentially a broken clavicle. They're calling it right now an AC injury on his shoulder. So we have to kind of monitor this. But if that's the case, you have a $4,000 Jalen Samuels. It does not look early in the week that James Conner is going to be playing this weekend. We'll know come really tomorrow, first practice reports, but early indications are that it's really bad. Also, third string running back Benny Snell Jr. also got injured. So right now it's looking like a $4,000 Jalen Samuel against a pass funnel defense in Indy, which I'm sure we'll break down more. Really good spot. And that's probably the most important injury to call out. Deshaun Jackson is going to be returning to practice this week. So that's something else to monitor. That's going to help, obviously, just them stretch the field. They've had Matt Collins there, who's done absolutely nothing. And it's also hurt a narrow offense means more attention for a guy like Zach Ertz. A couple other small things like Matt Breida leaving the game once again. Monitor that, but that's not going to be on the main slate. Calvin Ridley leaving the game, came back. Dede Westbrook left the game. So did Brandon Cooks. Cooks is going to be on bye with a concussion. So we'll see where that stands in a couple of weeks. That's the main injuries on the offense that I think stand out. You can talk about some other wide receivers or running backs, but for the most part, it's the big one being that you have James Conner likely, I would say right now, probably leaning more towards likely to not play on Sunday.
I guess there's a few by position we could just break down real quick. And I think we'll start off with the quarterback position. Patrick Mahomes, still doubtful, really trying to figure out if he's going to get in or not. With this matchup at home against the Vikings, if he plays or doesn't play, help us understand kind of what biggest impact this makes as far as from a game standpoint.
Yeah, so right now they're calling it an outside chance. Mahomes wants to play. Andy Reid wants him to play, but they're saying the doctors are going to have the final word. They've been kind of ballparking Week 10 as a spot where he'll play. So I think he leans more towards doubtful for this week. And yeah, that obviously affects a lot of players. It affects the upside and the ceilings and floors of Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, when you have Matt Moore out there, who looked really good. Andy Reid had a good scheme going for most of that game against the Packers. But I think it's going to affect what Minnesota can do. Minnesota right now is going to be a favorite if there is no Patrick Mahomes in this game. And what that's going to help is Dalvin Cook, who is priced up, most expensive price we've seen on him all season. But if you're going to tell me that he's going to have an even better chance of just being in a game script where they run the ball nonstop, it helps him. If indeed Patrick Mahomes misses, I think you have to say it hurts the passing game, not only Cousins, but the receivers there, who are two of the most expensive receivers on the slate against Kansas City this week. I'm just not sure you see a 35-plus pass attempt game from a guy like Cousins. So if indeed Mahomes is out, which it seems like that, I think the biggest benefit factor of that is going to be Dalvin Cook on the other side.
Minnesota right now comes in around middle of the pack when it comes to pass defense, ranked at 14th overall. And then in defense DVOA right now 11th. So a little bit of a concern there, I guess, when it comes from the passing game. Don't know exactly 100% healthy Pat Mahomes, I'd feel more confident. But if he still comes in, I mean, he's still going to be banged up with a dislocated knee. So I would assume that the smart approach would be, let's just take this by a cautious standpoint. But another guy who is on the brink right now, kind of in the same scenario, different injury, but should be coming back, is Cam Newton, going to be at home against the Tennessee Titans. Right now, it still has him as out. But, I mean, they're saying that he could go. They would just want to make sure he's ready. Does this have any significant impact in this game?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if he'll start this week. I think there was some murmurs that they're just going to run Kyle Allen out there once again. We'll see if that impacts it. I mean, yeah, if Cam is back, the way that they're playing right now is just a similar way I think that they will start to play and really play is just you have that offense kind of just going through Christian McCaffrey. I think that continues. If Cam is fully healthy, well, now the deep ball accuracy comes back a little bit. But I believe that Kyle Allen's probably going to be starting once again, if I had to guess, and just some early indications. But a couple of other injuries, and to close out really quarterback, Joe Flacco is going to miss. Brandon Allen is going to be stepping in his place. Hasn't played a snap this season. It doesn't look like a good spot for really anybody out there. Like Cortland Sutton's upside gets just absolutely crushed. A guy like Noah Fant's upside goes up a little bit. Tight ends, an inexperienced quarterback coming in should help the tight end, rookie tight end Noah Fant, but also Emmanuel Sanders gone and Jeff Herman injured in that game. A backup tight end. It allowed Noah Fant to play 80+% of the snaps and see a season high 8 targets. Miles Sanders left the game. He left the game, and Jordan Howard would then take on a bigger role. But it seems like Sanders should be good to go Sunday. They're saying that it wasn't anything serious.
And then what about wideout? I think the two guys I just wanted to break down real quick was Adam Thielen and then also Devontae Adams, who is looking like he might possibly be back against the Chargers.
Yeah, Adam Thielen, I would expect to return. Maybe if there is no Patrick Mahomes, like it's leaning that they don't want to push him as much, but I would expect Adam Thielen returns. He was close to playing on a short week with a hamstring, and it's just smart not to make a wide receiver play 4 days later with a tweaked hamstring. But now he gets sort of the mini bye after the Thursday night game. I would expect him to come back. Devontae Adams, I'm still pessimistic about his status, so he's yet to practice. Like last week, he didn't get ruled out on the Friday practice report like he usually did, but he was doubtful the whole weekend. There was really no chance that he played on Sunday. We'll see what happens. If there's a Wednesday or Thursday practice, it's okay. It's a foot injury for a wide receiver that usually takes on average around 6 weeks to return from. It's been about 5 weeks for him. So if I don't see any limited or full practices by Thursday or Friday and he comes in questionable, I'm just not too confident about his status. Packers have been able to win every single game without him so far. So yeah, I lean right now that Adam Thielen will be in. And if I had to guess, I would say Devontae Adams misses again, but we'll know come Thursday or Friday more so.
So as we go into this, Sal, what we'll do is we'll go in position by position, get a good first look, and kind of break down exactly what plays are very optimal and see exactly what plays that maybe we're not looking at that could be optimal. And I want to start off with the quarterback position, the highest priced quarterback on the slate, Russell Wilson. 7,100, the only quarterback available outside of Pat Mahomes that is available over 7K. Going to be at home against the Tampa Bay Bucks D that, you have to admit what we've seen in this rush defense, they're pretty stout, pretty tough to run against. And I'm thinking that, from what we've seen lately, they've ran the ball a lot. Chris Carson getting at least 20 carries in almost every game the last 5 or 6 games. And I want to ask you, with Russell Wilson here being at home, do you think this is a good matchup for him at this price point?
Yeah, so it's an interesting spot. Usually I don't want to pay for Russell Wilson as a touchdown favorite at home. Don't want to pay up for his stacks. We'll see that Tyler Lockett is more expensive. $7,100. It's top price point for maybe the best matchup that you'll get pass funnel in Tampa Bay. And then, yeah, Chris Carson has been seeing a ton of work and he's been fantastic, but now we'll have the toughest matchup that he's faced all year and probably the toughest matchup in the league against this Tampa Bay front that has been fantastic. And now they get Jason Pierre-Paul back last week, immediately came in with a sack and looked really good on defense. So it's a tough spot. I lean right now. I have 6 quarterbacks written down as interest. 3 of them are yeses and 3 of them are some interest, but not a ton. Russell Wilson falls in that some interest, but not a ton. It's partially due to price. And when you look into his stacking options, Tyler Lockett is priced up. Really good matchup. I still think you see Chris Carson in this type of situation, see a 20-plus touch game, even in a brutal spot. But yeah, the way that they're probably going to move the ball is through the air. The problem is a 6-point favorite at home, 31 pass attempts per game for Russell Wilson this year. There's a really good chance that pass attempt number goes closer to 25, like we've seen in a few weeks past when they're favored and leading from ahead. They just will abandon the passing game.
Bucks rush D, they've only surrendered 480 yards on the ground this year so far, best in the league, only 68.6 yards per game. However, though, on the other side of the ball, when it comes to the passing game, over 2,000 yards and giving up 285.9 yards per game. So I want to ask you, you say that you think that Carson will still get this workload, but if they can't get the ground game going, wouldn't you think that there would be an uptick in pass attempts for Russell Wilson in this matchup in order for them to be able to move the ball and essentially be able to win?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the caveat to it is if they stop them on the run, you might throw more. Just kind of relying on Vegas a little bit, being a 6-point favorite. I do think that even if it is ineffective, that you will still see a healthy dose of Chris Carson attempts as long as they're ahead. So Wilson can go to Tyler Lockett, Metcalf, whoever it might be early for a score or two in the first half. but then kind of just push even if it's ineffective on the ground, some more Chris Carson, one of the better backs, if not the best back in the league at breaking tackles. Yeah, we've seen this Bucks defense hold down Christian McCaffrey for 3 out of the 4 quarters they played for him. So it's a very good run defense, probably the best run defense. It's an interesting spot because if they stop the run, like you said, there would be more interest to pass the ball. I just am concerned with the slow paced game if there's actually enough passing volume to go around. If indeed Vegas is saying they're going to be a 5.5, 6.5, 7 point favorite right now.
Do you think the field will shy away from rostering Chris Carson at 7,200 on DraftKings? And also, I want to ask you, with this potential dreadful matchup that he has, could it be an anti-optimizer play? Let's just say he's very low owned to go and actually run with him, considering the actual type of production that he could potentially get based on the workload that he gets.
Yeah, so I think the field will go away from him. I think that that's probably like the right decision. But like you were saying, you're not going to get him in an optimizer. He's going to touch the ball on the ground probably 20 plus times. There's a chance in like the next 5 hours that Rashad Penny gets shipped out and traded away. So there's just no impact on his touches at all, even though there really hasn't been. So yeah, I think it's an interesting pivot play. We're going to get to that point where we'll see running backs, Chris Carson and Nick Chubb, two good running backs in tough matchups, are in the same price range. I think they just will naturally have lower ownership this week. And I think Chris Carson's, just because everybody knows how good this Tampa run stop has been, will have nothing. And if indeed Seattle gets chalky, it becomes an even better leverage spot to go to the running game.
As we go to the guys in the upper 6,000s now, we got Cousins, Stafford, and Rodgers all over 6,600 on DraftKings. And I want to ask you, of these three, which one would you gravitate to the most based on their matchups and opportunity this week?
Yeah, so it's going to be Matt Stafford for me. Just starting with the other two, really, though. Kirk Cousins, he's priced up a ton right now for a guy who, more times than not, in this spot, when your running back is top 2 in the league right now in Dalvin Cook this season and facing a bottom 2 run defense with no Patrick Mahomes, there's a really good chance that Madison and Dalvin Cook touch the ball for a combined 35 touch plus times, and Kirk Cousins throws the ball like 25 times. That's just not enough volume for me to want to get to a top dollar Kirk Cousins. It seems scary. Aaron Rodgers has been fantastic. He's been the last 2 weeks very effective, 300 plus yards, 3 touchdowns, but he's doing it on very limited attempts. I mean, last week their scheming is great. Aaron Jones has been out wide. They're running screens for him. He's running go routes, double moves, and he looks great, but he has 157 passing yards, receiving yards, more than half of Aaron Rodgers' total yardage. Like, that's not sustainable. Rodgers has had 30 attempts around there on average in the last 2 games when he's been very good. This efficiency probably doesn't hold up. They face Oakland and Kansas City. The Chargers are surely banged up, but they have Desmond King and Casey Hayward in the secondary. If I'm paying top dollar for Aaron Rodgers at $6,900 based off of 2 very weak opponents, and he's been just ultra effective and really efficient, it's probably a spot that I jump off a little bit. And also when you're talking about stacking him, if there's no Devontae Adams, like Aaron Jones would be my favorite person to stack him with. But then after that, and that's risky because it's a running back. And after that, nothing stands out. So Stafford has 2 clear stacking options, Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay, each of them having a huge week over the past 2 weeks. Golladay last week, Jones 4 touchdowns the week before. Stafford just averaging a lot of attempts with no Kerryon Johnson. They're going to want to throw the ball a lot more. We saw 4 running backs used. They didn't really have any upside in any of them. Ty Johnson was used the most in the receiving game, which helps Stafford. And you're going to have just a really good matchup. We've seen the last 2 weeks, and really for a while now, Oakland this season. Last week, Deshaun Watson gets there with DeAndre Hopkins. The week before, the Packers just go nuts on them. If I'm paying up this week in the 6K range, Matt Stafford right now on a Tuesday is the guy that seems like the best option.
Yeah, I think one thing with Cousins is, although they've been, throwing the ball a little bit more, however, though, these big plays have definitely helped him in regards to his yardage and overall production, but he's still in the 20s as far as averaging pass attempts. And I think when you look at the matchup for Stafford and the implied total as far as the team total, I would say that this is probably the better opportunity and the better area to attack. I think with Green Bay, I think you mentioned it, I could see their ground game being highly effective here, even though on both sides of the ball, rushing and passing, they suffered tremendously lately, especially with all the injuries for the Chargers. So I think Stafford at 6,800 would probably be the best. But I want to ask you, with the Minnesota game with Dalvin Cook, if you see a high ownership go to the running game, which is obviously a great play, do you still have any interest, though, for the passing game, knowing that if Thielen is back and there's high upside there?
Maybe some interest, but like the problem with that is you're paying such top dollar for Thielen and Diggs if you want to stack them. I think they're the 2 of the 3 highest priced wide receivers. Like they're priced as if they're DeAndre Hopkins, Julio Jones, and those types of players. So it's just really restrictive. And then you're paying top dollar for Kirk Cousins. So it's going to be probably a very contrarian stack, also because Dalvin Cook's going to have some ownership, I imagine. It's just a spot that I'm probably going to avoid. I'd rather just get to Matt Stafford for $100 more, and then you can get a cheaper second wide receiver option into your stacks. Marvin Jones is, I believe, only at 6,000. And similar things can be said for some more stacks I'm sure we'll talk about in quarterbacks, guys like Jameis Winston even.
Yeah, Jameis Winston was actually the next guy I wanted to speak about. Saw a game this past Sunday where Mike Evans went off. I just saw someone in the chat about you breaking down Mike Evans and being a good play. Outside of that, this matchup that he just faced, he now is going to have a matchup against Seattle, where Seattle, we've seen at times, even this past week, I mean, Matt Schaub threw for almost 500 yards against them, that the secondary is very vulnerable. And regardless if there was some garbage time or that yardage was picked up or not, they've struggled against some passing offenses. Cincinnati at home, they suffered against the Saints, the Rams. So there have been multiple games this season where the passing game has been the area of attack against this defense. And so Winston, we know he's going to throw the ball. He 43 attempts last game. However, though, the turnovers. Turned it over again 4 times this past game as well. 6 times before that against Carolina. So at 6,100, knowing the amount of volume that he's going to throw, is this an area that maybe you have interest in?
Yeah, it definitely is. So like the turnover thing, yeah, makes him a terrible real life quarterback. But when it comes to fantasy, honestly, it's good in my opinion. Like if he's going to throw a pick six or he's going to throw a pick and they have a short field, now he's just forced to throw the ball more. And we know with the weapons that they have that he's going to pick up chunk yardage and touchdowns. And that's exactly what happened last week. They had 2 early turnovers. They got down 14 or got down 11. It was 14-3. And then it was just a pass script the rest of the way. And that's when you love playing Jameis Winston, when you know they're not going to hand it off to their 3 running backs like 7 times each. So I like Jameis this week. You do have Godwin and Evans both above 7K. But we'll get into the running back soon. And there's a lot of very cheap running backs as of right now that seem like you can pair in there. Always value at tight end and other spots. So I like Jameis. Seattle secondary, I completely agree. It's been very suspect. It's probably been masked up a little bit because they're winning games, but it's been bad. We saw week 1 Cincinnati tear them apart. We've seen Mason Rudolph in some mop-up duty have a little bit of success. Teddy Bridgewater had success. And then, yes, Matt Schaub last week, albeit the fourth quarter, and really just towards the end of the fourth quarter was garbage time. That game was close. Matt Schaub, in spots where it was just playing normal defense, not a soft zone or anything, he was still tearing them up. Yes, you have Julio Jones, so that helps. But now Chris Godwin, Mike Evans are going to get to go up against it. I think it's a really good spot for both of those receivers and Jameis. Jameis right now, like Stafford, is in a early pool of 3 quarterbacks who I seem to have the most interest in.
Any guys sub 6K that you have your eye on or you think is of great value? I want to talk about Derek Carr at home against Detroit this week. We saw Daniel Jones this past week really expose them. I mean, this is a few weeks in a row now where the Detroit Lions secondary has given up a lot of yardage and touchdowns to the wide receiver position with quarterbacks just throwing all over the field. So I want to ask you, at 5,500 with Derek Carr, and Oakland seems to have a little bit of a high run and fly total right now, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have any interest here for Derek Carr at 5,500?
So this is a spot that I put as a question mark, probably look more into it. I know that Detroit is giving up a lot of points and really on the ground because I think a big piece wise, they haven't had Mike Daniels for about a month, defensive tackle for them, good run stopper. So I actually have more interest in Josh Jacobs here than the passing game. You have a priced up Darren Waller. He's still affordable. He's a 6K tight end now. It's fine if you want to get there. Yeah, Tyrell Williams is affordable. He came back and he played over 80% of the snaps, had a long touchdown. He looked like himself. So it's really good that he got over that foot injury. So there are stacking options with Tyrell and Darren Waller there. That's why he's a question mark and not a no right now. He is one of 2 guys, one of 3 guys below 6K, one of 2 guys in the 5K range that I have marked. Derek Carr is a question mark. Yeah, I have to look into it more. If Slay continues to be hobbled or out, that's only a bigger benefactor for this team. The other spot is just Sam Darnold at 5,900. Yes, he's been terrible. Really tough matchup in one of those spots. Now he gets Miami, which is like the cure. So it can go either way here. Miami's defense can get the Jets offense, and that's good for them. You can look at it that way. I think you look at it more so as it's Sam Darnold in this offense having a good spot against Miami. And yes, they're going to be favorites, but they're not nearly as big of favorites as other spots. So it might not just be the 35 rush attempt game like most teams will have against Miami. They're only 5.5 point favorites here, which I think favors Darnold a little bit. You're going to have good matchups, definitely in the slot for Jamison Crowder against Wiltz, and on the outside, Robbie Anderson. Even if Xavier Howard comes back, it's still a good spot. And I don't even think you see Xavier Howard on him for anywhere near the far majority of the game. So Sam Darnold at 5,900, scary spot, but there's some clear stacking spots and a good matchup. He would be the 3rd guy that's in my like early interests. And then rounding it out, is right now Russell Wilson, Ryan Fitzpatrick as just like a very cheap option, and then Derek Carr, like you brought up. I think Derek Carr is a player that I have to look more into as the week goes on.
Looking at these run implied totals, this might be one of the lowest type of weeks I've ever seen when it comes to run implied totals for teams. But Sal, I mean, I think what was it last week? We had quite a few guys in the upper 20s. As far as quarterbacks, a handful of them have run implied totals. And this week, I mean, we're looking at quite a few that are under 23 points. I mean, in fact, there's about 10 or 12 guys or 10 or 12 teams per se that have run implied totals of that low. So speaking of Sam Darnold in regards to Derek Carr, Oakland has a 26.3 run implied total. It's the second highest in the slate. Jets, though, all the way down at 21.8. I want to ask you, because Sam Darnold, he's got a little question mark as far as if he plays or not. So is there any concern here with the injury as far as Sam Darnold goes?
So no concern right now that I've seen. Yeah, that's actually something that stood out and surprised me. You have a 50.5 total for Detroit and Oakland, which makes it an even more better spot to stack. Like I still prefer stacking the Stafford side, but getting back 1 to 2 players on the Oakland side, you feel pretty good about when they have a 26.25 total as of right now. So yeah, it's a good spot for both of those teams in that spot. Yeah, Sam Darnold, I saw opened up around 21.5, 22. I saw his bet up to 23. So that's good, seeing a little bit of an uptick there. They're still going to be favorites. So yes, the running game comes into play a little bit more. But right now, he's a guy that I'll still have interest in come Sunday. And the biggest interest is probably going to come in those first two guys, Matt Stafford, Jameis Winston. And I'll see where I end up on Russell Wilson. But him being a decent sized favorite at home might not get there. The other thing to point out, yeah, you touched on like all these team totals are lower. Like I don't think we've ever seen a spot or a slate, and there's less games, only 10, 20 teams playing. It's just so gross, the quarterbacks. I mean, some guys just to name: Brandon Allen, Kyle Allen. You have Baker playing terrible. Mitch Trubisky on the slate. Mason Rudolph, Matt Moore, Case Keenum, like Ryan Fitzpatrick. Like these are the quarterbacks on this slate. It's starting to make more sense why you see like a lot of in the teens and team totals. Like Sam Darnold is on a slate where he's probably one of the top half better quarterbacks on it. So it's a kind of gross slate.
And I was going to ask you, closing out with the quarterbacks, is based on what we're seeing here as far as upside this week and matchups that present themselves, would you see yourself having a smaller pool of quarterbacks or spreading it out based on what we're seeing here with run implied totals, with upside, with ceilings? Because what I'm seeing here is there's over a handful of quarterbacks that really just have no upside. And I mean, when it comes to their ceiling, it's just nothing compared to maybe Russell Wilson, Matt Stafford, and I mean, maybe Josh Allen, if we can throw that in there. But I mean, it's a significant gap. And so when it comes to the overall player pool this week, do we find it more strategic to have just a few guys with high upside, or do you want to spread it out and take risks on these guys that maybe might not get you there?
Yeah, so like I usually want to spread it out and have just stacks, really. So that's how I get to the quarterbacks. But like you said, this week you have a lot of bad quarterbacks. Like I don't want to be playing Brandon Allen, Case Keenum, Matt Moore, any of those guys to really any extent. I think Phillip Rivers is a guy in the 5K range we didn't touch on that has some upside. The offensive line, though, against the Packers, good pass rush seems scary. Like usually you have like 4 or 5 valuable or viable options in the 5K range. I see maybe 2 this week. So yeah, it's tougher to get to a lot of quarterbacks. I think just naturally because you have bad players on the slate that I'll get to just a smaller pool of quarterbacks and stacks. Usually I'll try and get in, even if it's like a couple of stacks, a handful of stacks of a team, I'll probably end up around like 7 or 8 quarterbacks and some stacks. This week, I'm not going to be surprised if it's like a 6 or a 5 with heavy concentration around like 3 teams.
Who's your highest rated quarterback going into this week as a first impression?
Yeah, so definitely important to point out that it's like Tuesday, sort of a first look here. It's going to come down between Stafford and Jameis Winston right now. It's hard for me to kind of choose between them. I'll say Stafford for right now, but both of those guys are top of, I guess you could say, my ranking / board right now.
All right, let's go into running backs, Sal. And before we do, I want to once again thank our sponsor, Yahoo Sports Daily Fantasy. Guys, if you haven't signed up yet, you can do so and get $30 in Yahoo Sports rewards points. And what that'll do is that'll get you in 3 entries into the Baller tournament this weekend. But the promo code is NFL Strategy. It's down there on the left-hand side if you're watching this show, guys. So Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, if you haven't signed up yet, go ahead and do so. Use that code, get 3 free entries into the Baller. And also they have CSV upload now. So if you're looking to multi-enter, you have that ability to do so. So running backs, I'm thinking this is going to be one of the key positions this week due to really the passing games not showing much upside as far as what we're seeing from a first look. And I think that you mentioned a cheap running back in Jalen Samuels that might as well call it now early chalk because of what we're seeing now with the injuries to the Pittsburgh backfield. So going into it, I guess we'll break down the two highest guys first in salary that really separate themselves from a majority of other running backs. And that's Dalvin Cook at 9,500 and Christian McCaffrey at 10K. Looking at, having a first look this week, Sal, so far, do you see yourself wanting to make sure that you have these guys rostered in your lineups for week 9?
Yeah, I think I do. So obviously McCaffrey, first running back to hit 10K this year. I think just first player in general to hit 10K. And he should. The guy's averaging over 30 fantasy points per game. We saw him in a tough matchup last week against the 49ers. Sure, it was very much aided by 3 big plays, but that's what this guy can do. He still gets you 30 fantasy points. So even though he's $10,000, I still think it's fine if you want to get there. I prefer Dalvin Cook in his matchup in a potential 24, 25 touch game for Dalvin Cook against a very weak run defense. But the reason why these guys are viable is, you touched on it. There's not that many great passing offenses on the slate at all that have 2 wide receivers. The ones that do have 2 wide receivers, they're kind of priced up, like Tampa Bay, to an extent Detroit. You have the Seattle passing game priced up. In those spots make it harder to fit these top-end running backs. But you have Jalen Samuels that potentially and hopefully becomes just an extreme value play. Makes it a lot easier when you have a $4,000 option to fit in these running backs. So we'll have to see later in the week. Injuries will help a lot. But $9,500 for Dalvin Cook, I think that's a fair price point. I think it's a fine price point, especially if we do get this kind of value into Jalen Samuels. Also, we'll get to it, but guys like Mark Walton, Devin Singletary, there are options to make it work out and still get an upside passing game with one of these expensive backs.
Yeah, I think, what we're seeing here, I think Christian McCaffrey kind of made it aware last week that, it's always true. Talent is superior to the defensive matchup in some instances when it comes to a dominant player. And even though they got blown out, and even though he wasn't as productive in some areas, he still ran for 117 yards and a touchdown against the 49ers defense, caught 5 balls. I mean, this guy is just absolutely incredible. And so I want to ask you, could you see a lot of people this week going Jalen Samuels and Christian McCaffrey as a combo at running back?
Yeah, if you could fit it in, I think you will. And last week was the week that McCaffrey's ownership was 10%. And now I think people are going to realize that that probably should never be the case. Same thing for Saquon Barkley, has a fine game at no ownership. These expensive running backs, they restrict your lineups. But last week there was a ton of wide receiver value that could have gotten you there if you wanted to. They weren't necessarily needed, but you could have got to them and feel good about it, and then they produce like they usually do. So $10,000, the fact that he's priced up to the 5-figure range, I think it suppresses his ownership still a little bit. Like you said, Jalen Samuels will allow people to get to him, but I think a lot of people are just going to be kind of scared off by seeing 5 digits in his price and just go right to Dalvin Cook, which honestly is just probably the better play in general. But if the ownership is different and you see McCaffrey at 10% again and Cook's up to 20, then playing Cook is completely fine because it's a great matchup. But McCaffrey should probably never be 10% owned unless he's $11,000.
The third highest running back, Sal, is 7,700 is Le'Veon Bell. And I got to say, I think he's overpriced here. And I don't know, even if the matchup seems as good as it is, I don't think, first off, this offense and Adam Gase knows how to utilize him. But also, I mean, he's just not able to kind of hit where we want him to hit as far as upside and a ceiling. It seems like he's pretty capped in this offense. He's going to get, 10, 15 rushing attempts at that. But I mean, the offensive line hasn't done anything for him. He's not these targets that he's getting, these short little catches. There's really no upside there. And so I got to ask you, I mean, based on what we've seen week in and week out, do you feel confident in going back to Le'Veon Bell at 7,700? We know the matchup is great, but I mean, at some point, it's kind of like the Arizona Cardinals. You just got to stop and say no.
Yeah. So right now, just like early in the week, I like the spot right now against these Dolphins. They're giving up 32 fantasy points per game to the running back. They're not even just absolutely terrible as a whole unit against the run and stopping them. Now they're bottom third in the league, but they're not the worst or second to worst or anything like that. They're just getting so much rushing against them that they're giving up a lot of yards. So in terms of pure volume, yeah, they're going to give up a lot of yards because teams are just having so many attempts against them. In terms of efficiency, they're not allowing backs to be ultra efficient against them. Nothing. It's closer to middle of the pack than really bad. But that being said, yeah, Bell's passing game usage hasn't been great as of late. You don't like to see that. One of the games was more so game script, and then he sees 4 targets against New England. So a tough matchup there. So I think that it's a little bit kind of skewed in a small 2 or 3 game sample. I think I feel fine getting to Bell here. And the biggest reason why is there's a lot of running backs on this slate. You have 2 that are really expensive, the 2 best options, and they're priced like it with McCaffrey and Cook. But then after that, you see a nice discount to a guy like Le'Veon Bell, who does have a good matchup and really has no competition for touches. Whereas guys who are also in this range, say Aaron Jones at 7,000, yes, he's been fantastic, but even in that incredible game last week where he breaks two huge receptions, one for a touchdown, one he steps out of bounds barely, he still only played about 60% of the snaps, 58% of the snaps. So there is a competition for time there, where with Le'Veon Bell, it's just not there.
I mean, we know volume is key when it comes to the running back position. And so, I mean, even though it's a short sample size, but if you want to compare it to the first half of the season, he's had 10 targets the last 3 games. In the first 4 games, he had 32 targets. Rushing attempts, have gone down as well, 14, 15, and now 9. And, we can say, oh, well, the game flow, whatever the case may be. But I got to be honest with you. I don't think that the volume is there to justify if the production can be there as well at 7,700. Would you feel more confident in paying down a little bit for, let's say, a Nick Chubb or a Chris Carson, where maybe not the best of matchups for them? However, though, the volume and workload is going to be there.
Yeah, so especially for both those guys who are probably going to see more volume, if ownership indicates that it should be a move, like Bell's 25% owned or something, then maybe I get there, because his price point is definitely priced up for what this matchup is. Pretty much every single running back has had a good spot against them, but I agree that his volume is not as great as some cheaper guys. It's really just a matchup. So I want to see what Bell's ownership comes in at. I think that just naturally it might be tougher to get to Bell, because a lot of people are going to pay for one of those, I would imagine, top 2 running backs, probably Cook, and then you pair him with the Jalen Samuels. I feel like that's going to be a way a lot of lineup starters, Dalvin Cook, Jalen Samuels, and then paying for Le'Veon Bell becomes tough when you want to pay for any decent wide receivers or quarterbacks. So I think his ownership might be lower than expected. We'll see, though. Probably, I believe tomorrow ownership numbers will be ran. So right now, I think construction optimally on a Tuesday would be a top-end running back, Jalen Samuels, if he opens up, a Mark Walton, one of those 4K running backs that are surely underpriced. And then it kind of makes the 7K range the contrarian way to go. But maybe that doesn't mean it's optimal.
So let's talk about Nick Chubb. 300 less, or excuse me, 400 less, going to be going into Denver. We just saw him fumble twice. However, though, he still produced on the ground to some extent, 20 attempts and 131 yards. So had some great big explosive plays too in the running game. And we all know how stout New England's defense is. Denver, pretty solid rush D to a certain extent. There have been some games where the running backs have gotten the best of them. And last week was one of them, Marlon Mack. I think, you look at his game log, he had 19 attempts for 76 yards and a touchdown. Some might say, well, he didn't get 100 yards or whatever the case may be, but he was effective, 4 yards per attempt. And so Nick Chubb, now we know they're going to give him the ball. And I think they're way more confident in their running game, as you saw last week, compared to what Baker Mayfield's doing in the passing game. So any love for Nick Chubb here at 7,300?
Yeah, so I think Nick Chubb's actually in a good spot just relative to how they play this game out. You have Denver's secondary, which has been very good this year. So is their run defense. I've been respecting this run defense. I'm trying not, and I really haven't played any running backs against them this season, but Chubb has already shown in multiple difficult spots. The Ravens earlier in the season, last week against the Patriots. It really doesn't matter. This guy just breaks tackles, and they need to work through him. Their offensive line for pass protection, not so much run protection or run blocking, but pass protection is terrible. Yes, Baker Mayfield has been bad, but look into it. I mean, his adjusted line play is awful. Last week against New England, he had maybe 2 seconds in the pocket at best sometimes before he had to scramble or just become sacked. He sacked, I think, 5 times in that game. So not great at all. So yeah, the way that you play if you're Cleveland is you go through the running game. 7,300, it becomes that Le'Veon Bell range where I think more people gravitate towards Bell if they're paying for this range of running back, which, yeah, I do like Nick Chubb. I like him more than Chris Carson. Definitely a somewhat easier matchup. They're very similar backs, Nick Chubb and Carson. They're probably, to me, comparable in comps just because of the way that they break tackles and gut out yards. But $7,300, I'll have some interest. I really think he's going to go low owned, and if he does, I'll have even more interest.
Another guy we can talk about that I feel is in a great spot against a defense that has really just collapsed. I think this whole team has collapsed, to be honest with you. Injuries have caused an issue for it, but I think just the lack of engagement and really the missed tackles and the miscues all over the field. But the Chargers' rush defense has just not been good. And we saw David Montgomery last week, 135 yards and a touchdown against this front line. And now we have Aaron Jones, who is really being facilitated in multiple ways in this unit for the Packers. Saw what he did this past week against the Chiefs. Not so much on the running ground, even though he averaged 5.2 yards a carry, but it was his ability to catch the ball and break out in the receiving game that has really gave him a lot of upside this year as well. There's been multiple games this year where he's seen 8 targets, 7 targets, 8 and 7 again. And so, I mean, he's definitely a weapon, especially with Adams being out, has really stepped up. And so now he's going to be facing the Chargers, and he's only at 7,000. So with this volume and kind of how they've been operating this offense, can we go back to Aaron Jones here?
So, yeah, I think for me, it's going to be very much contingent on Davante Adams' status. Like, if Davante Adams ends up playing, I'm probably not going to want to pay $7K for Aaron Jones because, like you said, right now, he's been the last 2 weeks probably the number one receiver for the Packers, just in terms of targets and how they're scheming for him. And they're scheming very well for him. I mean, a wide receiver screen on the outside to him as a running back for a touchdown. He's lining up on the outside more than he is in the backfield for passing downs. So $7,000, if Davante Adams is out, yeah, it's fine. We saw last week David Montgomery had the best game of his career, mainly because Chargers run defense was missing their starting 2 defensive tackles. Melvin Ingram has been banged up, and there were just holes everywhere. So it really didn't matter. So I like this Packers run blocking advantage is better for them against the Chargers defensive line, even if if it is indeed banged up once again. The big piece is Davante Adams, because if you can project Aaron Jones to see like 5 to 6 targets from Aaron Rodgers, but he has upside of where he's being used on the field, and then another 15 rush attempts on the ground as a favorite, it's a good spot. The concern is that if Davante Adams comes back, that's going to cut into anything that he's really doing in the receiving game, and a lot of it not being the priority anymore. And then also Jamal Williams is still playing 40% of the snaps, going to get red zone work on some drives. So I think you can cut holes into Aaron Jones, but I think if Davante Adams is out, he's a very strong play at 7K.
Going now into the cheaper guys, you spoke on one guy at 4K and Jalen Samuels, but anyone else pretty much standing out in regards to maybe a cheaper running back that people are looking for, maybe like the Tevin Coleman of last week that has some volume, that has some upside, and is essentially in a good matchup?
Yeah, so there's 3 guys down here that early in the week stand out. Have to do like just some deeper research, you can say. So yeah, Jalen Samuels at the start, we talked about him, should be like a conversation around how much do you get of him instead of what does his ownership number should be, because you're probably going to come in over the field on even if he's 40% owned. It's a question of, do I want $4,000 Jalen Samuels with no probably James Conner? We'll see. Benny Snell Jr., third string, potentially out. It just leaves Jalen Samuels and Trey Edmonds as the running backs, and that's how it's looking right now. And you get a really good matchup. Indy is a zone defense that funnels to pass-catching running backs and tight ends, and Jalen Samuel is one of the better pass-catching running backs, a former tight end in college. So, yeah, $4,000, it becomes very obvious. You probably just plug and play him, a guy that you can feel pretty confident about getting somewhere around 16 to 18 touches with upside there against in a team that's starting still Mason Rudolph and wants to run first. So it's him by far and away above everybody if Connor's out. And then the other 2 options, Mark Walton and Devin Singletary. Singletary, maybe more so game script dependent. Now from last week, playing 60+% of the snaps over Frank Gore. Now they'll be 9.5-point favorites. So there is a chance Frank Gore just comes in and as a favorite now they run more with him. But at 4,700, I think he's a fine GPP option as of right now. And then Mark Walton, we know Kenyon Drake is out. Now he's going to be out there in Arizona. So it's pretty much Mark Walton and Kalen Ballage. They only had those 2 running backs active last night. I want to see if they activate Myles Gaskin, because that will hurt Mark Walton's upside. If they don't come Sunday and it's just 2 backs, Mark Walton will be the guy pretty much getting almost every single touch in between the 20s. Kalen Ballage, maybe some goal line work. But we saw Walton have 14 touches, 3 catches last night, and then he'll draw a pretty beneficial matchup with C.J. Mosley, supposed to be out for maybe the rest of the season for the Jets, middle linebacker there. So good spot for Walton. The way I'm looking at it right now is Samuels is the better play in both formats as of now. Mark Walton's a better play in cash over Singletary, and I think I'd rather have Singletary in GPPs over Walton.
Yeah, no, I can understand from a price point on Walton, but I will say that it does kind of scare me as far as the Jets defense, 6th best in the league when it comes to the rushing game and stopping the run. I've only surrendered 664 yards so far this season. That's 5th best in the league. And with Walton, I just don't know about the talent level. Yeah, he'll get some volume. Yeah, there's really only him and Ballage. But as far as from a running standpoint, I think that Fitzpatrick, who we really didn't talk about, I think is probably the passing game is more in play here against the Jets. As we know, there's vulnerability there with some corners and some areas to attack with the wideouts. So when we go into wide receiver, we're definitely going to these Dolphins wideouts. But as far as Walton, I'm not sure, Sal, if that's somewhere that I would feel comfortable. I want to ask you about David Montgomery. 27 rushing attempts last week. Nagy said that they were going to run the ball more. Got a little bit of a tough matchup, though, this week with Philly being a stingy run defense that they are. But any love for Montgomery with the amount of volume that we just saw, and if this is a game plan for them moving forward as far as a run-heavy offense?
Yeah, it makes sense that it should be their game plan. They only ran 5 times the week before. Mitch Trubisky looked terrible. It really made no sense. Montgomery only 2 carries 2 weeks ago. I think I jump off of the train for this week, though. I like Montgomery last week at the price point and also just the matchup. When a defensive line is missing 3 of their pieces, it's going to be very good. Now, the Philadelphia Eagles, they're also missing players on their defensive line, but it just hasn't mattered because their defensive line depth is some of the best in the league, and they remain a top 5 defensive line. It's going to be tough this week. To imagine David Montgomery having similar success. I think it was a lot of, sure, they wanted to scheme and run the ball more, but they had early success because of the matchup, so they continued to go towards it. I think this is a spot where Montgomery can still see maybe 15 carries, but he's going to be very touchdown dependent. And for $5,200, still affordable, sure, but a 5-point underdog against this Eagles line, I probably lean to get away from it.
Any other guys before we go into wide receiver style that maybe we didn't mention or we looked over to go ahead and just take notice of maybe early on this week before we really start finalizing rosters heading down the week stretch?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly touch on 2 guys. Josh Jacobs' price is up, but I like him, especially if Mike Daniels is out at 6,500 early on. He should see 18 plus carries on the ground. Even when they're trailing by 2 touchdowns, this guy is being very effective on the ground. Detroit's given up top 3 fantasy points per game to the running back position this year. And then I think the Chargers running backs, even though Melvin Gordon's price is coming down, I can't trust it with the offensive line play for the Chargers, but I do like Austin Eckler a little bit, really just GPP play, not a high ownership type of player. But if he comes in low owned, maybe like 5% owned, I feel pretty good about getting to like an 8 to 10% of Austin Eckler in a spot where they're going to be trailing and needed to be passing a little bit more against the Packers.
Wide receiver now. And, looking at it, it's kind of interesting. No guys over 8K, but there are 8 guys in the 7K range. 2 of them questionable in Adams and Thielen. But Sal, a lot of different areas here that we can go with. And I guess we'll start with the second highest price since we broke down Thielen a little bit, Kenny Galladay. You would think in a great matchup against Oakland, especially now they already traded one corner away. And, as we've known that they've had injuries to the secondary this season. So Galladay coming off a big game against the Giants. Any love here? Because I know you said Stafford. So is Galladay the guy that you want to pair Stafford with?
Yeah, I feel good pairing him with both of those receivers in terms of Galladay and Jones. But yeah, $7,700 for Galladay. I mean, it's clearly a steep price point. But DraftKings, this is, if we didn't get sort of lucky with Kenyon Drake getting traded and Mark Walton opening up as somewhat of a value, and hopefully we get Jalen Samuels, because this is one of the tightest price slates I've seen. You have every mid-range wide receiver pretty much, instead of being in the 6K range, is now to the mid to upper tier in the 7K range. You have priced up tight ends in the 6K range we'll get to. The 2 highest priced running back prices we've seen all season. Like, it's a very tight pricing system, and it's going to be maybe bailed out by one player, and that's Jalen Samuels. So yeah, I like both of the receivers for Detroit. Marvin Jones is cheaper, but if you want to get to Galladay, it's fine. I like both of the receivers for Tampa Bay. They're both priced up as well. $7,300 for Godwin, $72 for Evans. You need big performances out of them for that to pay off. But I like them in their matchups. A lot of guys are just priced up. I mean, you have, sure, Allen Robinson's in a good spot this week against the Eagles, but even he is priced up $800 more than we're used to seeing him at $6,800. So very tight pricing at wide receiver. You could say the same probably about tight end and a little bit about running back. So yeah, it's a tough week right now. The guys that I have a lot of interest in at quarterback, I'm just going to automatically probably have interest in their wide receivers.
If Thielen doesn't play, because the next guy is Stephon Diggs at 7,600. If Thielen doesn't play, how much more stock do you put into Diggs in the pass game, if at all?
Yeah, so the stock would go up. Like we saw it on Thursday night in a good matchup. He was like the only option in the passing game. You had some short passes to Cook, some to like each of the tight ends, but anything downfield was all Diggs. And he's probably a top 3 route runner in the league. So he was getting open, and he's going to have another good matchup this week. So yes, if Thielen is out, I'll get to Diggs. But as of right now, like if Thielen plays, I'm probably not going to have much interest in either of these receivers. Sure, you can get to them as one-offs in your tournament lineups if you want, have them in your player pool. But at the end of the day, they're priced up in a spot where I don't want to play their quarterback who's also priced up. I want to play their priced up running back. So I really can't pay that steep of a price point for either of them and to kind of pair them together. But yeah, if Thielen is out, I'll have more interest in Diggs. Otherwise, I'm just going to side to the Kenny Galladays of the world and these Tampa Bay receivers up here.
Next 2 guys we can break down are guys that we talked about a little bit earlier, and a guy that you were big on this past Sunday against the Tennessee Titans, but Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Going to be heading into Seattle. And, we know that the volume is going to be there as far as how much Jameis Winston throws. And we spoke about a little bit the vulnerability of this Seattle secondary. There's definitely some areas that they can attack. And I think that Evans and Godwin both have upside here. And I think of these wide receivers in the 7K, I think I would feel comfortable rostering them the most. But love to hear what you have to say in regards to Godwin and Evans.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the 7K wide receivers, the two that I like the most are Godwin and Evans. This week, it's probably, I have to break it down more, so I don't want to take a strong stance on it, but Godwin's the guy who stands out a little bit more coming out of the slot. On the outside, Shaq Griffin has been good for Seattle, but I don't think you see him covering Mike Evans. They usually put Trey Flowers, their bigger cornerback, on that type of a receiver. So that's a really good matchup for Mike Evans if it's Trey Flowers for most of the game. Yeah, so when you factor it in, I think that Evans, if you're going to put Kenny Golladay at 7,700, Evans should be higher than the price point of 7,200. So should Godwin based on his season. So I think you're getting somewhat of a discount relative to this slate with all these guys priced up. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are my two favorite 7K receivers, and then Kenny Golladay would be the third.
And let me ask you, with Godwin and Evans, it seems like these guys both go off like a separate week. And so, Evans just had this big week this past time, but Evans has been just getting, flourished with targets. 17 2 games ago, 12 this past time. Godwin, a little bit different, 12 and 8. But it seems like these two are the two primary guys nonstop in this passing offense. And so I want to ask you, if you had to pick one, instead of wanting to roster both, if you just wanted to go with Winston and one of these guys, who would you say has the upper hand in this matchup, or who would you want to go with more between Godwin and Evans?
Yeah, right now I'll go with Godwin. That might change by the end of the week, but just early on, I'll go with Godwin. And yeah, you're right. They've been literally rotating like ceiling games of 2+ touchdowns and 100 yards. They have had like their clear, obvious, better matchups for each of them in the past weeks. Last week's Godwin's matchup was tough against Logan Ryan when Evans was fantastic. You could say the same thing about their Saints matchup. You say the same thing about Carolina, whatever it might be. This week, though, Godwin and Evans both have good matchups. Like they're both going to have really good matchups, but Godwin in the slot will fully avoid Shaq Griffin, where Evans might see him a little bit. So I'll lean Godwin there.
One more guy I want to talk about in this 7K range is Tyreek Hill at 7,400. And I want to ask you, does his ceiling somewhat change right now? Because obviously Pat Mahomes is out. But, in regards to the type of offense that they're running now, is it worth justifying the 7,400 price point? Or do you just think he's too expensive? Because I'll tell you from what I believe, based on how I've seen them play with Mahomes being out, yes, he's getting some targets, but I just feel like the big play opportunities aren't there as if Mahomes was behind the snap. And so I want to ask you, at 7,400, do you want to pay that for Tyreek Hill, or do you just see way more value elsewhere?
I see way more value elsewhere, but if he's going to be like 3% owned, then I might have some, because you could have 5% and be almost double the field and no leverage on yourself there in terms of if it goes wrong. But yeah, so there's a couple of things. Tyreek Hill, yes, he has the touchdown with Mac Moore against Chris Harris Jr. And really it was a zone defense, not so much a shadow on that play, but he looked good there. He looked okay last week, nothing crazy, but yeah, his ceiling is 100% impacted. Like the Patrick Mahomes Tyreek Hill combo is the deadliest in football, without a doubt, both of their skill sets. And last week we saw Tyreek Hill. It probably would have been an 80-yard touchdown if Patrick Mahomes is in the game. It's about 4 or 5 yards underthrown by Matt Moore, and it ends up just being incomplete. 2 cornerbacks, a safety and a cornerback there to break it up, but he had like 3 steps on those guys. It would have been a deep touchdown. So that is like the exact example of why Matt Moore is just going to cap this guy's ceiling. So yeah, he's still priced up at 7,400. He's clearly has a huge ceiling on him if the passes get there, but with Matt Moore throwing you the ball, those targets are much lower upside overall.
One guy that's just outside the 7K range on DK is Allen Robinson. And I feel this week is definitely a week where we could see some upside here in this passing game just because of how bad the Philadelphia pass defense has been this year. Completely different compared to their rush defense. But where you want to attack them is the passing game. And so Robinson, it's unfortunate he has Trubisky throwing to him. But I must say, the targets are there. It's not something that we have to worry about. But I think in order for Chicago to really have a chance in this game, I don't know if they're going to be able to run the ball as effective as they did last week. Even though Montgomery's at a great price point, I don't mind it from a value standpoint. But I feel like the passing game here is an area that you want to attack. And so I want to ask you, at 6,800, is this somewhere we can go for Allen Robinson?
Yeah, so he's currently listed as a yes for me. I do think he's slightly overpriced. He's probably like a $6,500 wide receiver. But yeah, very good matchup. The one thing to point out is that Jalen Mills came back 2 games ago. He gave up yardage to Amari Cooper, but just 2 incredible catches by Cooper. He played him very well if you look at Pro Football grades. And then last week, Pro Football Focus. And then if you look last week, you have John Brown being held down by primarily Jalen Mills. So Jalen Mills for this secondary, he's not one of the best cornerbacks in the league, but he's the best cornerback that Philly has had this season. And his first 2 games back from a year-long injury, he's looked really good. So he'll probably see Allen Robinson, but Robinson will go into the slot on a third to 40% of his snaps. He'll have a really good matchup overall in this game. The 30 to 40% of the game that Jalen Mills is on him, it might be a little bit difficult. But yeah, I think Allen Robinson's one of the more underrated receivers in the league. Eagles are still allowing the most points to the wide receiver position. 6,800, it's sort of a steep price point, but that's sort of the narrative for this slate in general with guys priced up. So yeah, I think you can pay that price and feel good about it. It's probably just a one-off spot for me. I don't really want to, even against a weak secondary, target a Mitch Trubisky. Seems like a Millie Maker type build if you want to stack Chicago, but I probably just get to Allen Robinson.
Allen Robinson so far this season, 149 routes on the outside, 197 routes from the slot. So I want to ask you, if he's not being covered by Jalen Mills, does the assignment go to who? Ronald Darby, Avonte Maddox? Which cornerback will see him primarily in the slot most?
Yeah, so it's probably a mixture of players. If Maddox is healthy, he might play some, but he'll primarily play outside. It's probably guys like Douglas in the slot that you'll see the most usage out of him in terms of his defense in the slot. I don't think you'll see guys like Jalen Mills, though, following a guy like Allen Robinson into the slot. So I think it'll be a fine matchup overall on the outside there. I think probably the primary slot cornerback that you see is a Sidney Jones, which is really where Anthony Miller will probably see his matchup. But if anything, it'll probably be Sidney Jones into the slot for the Eagles on Allen Robinson, which is a very good matchup for Allen Robinson. The matchup is already good for him against Jalen Mills. Like, I don't want to overhype Jalen Mills. It's just Jalen Mills has been in 2 games already the best cornerback that this team has had. So yeah, really good matchup overall wherever they line up Allen Robinson.
Rasul Douglas, who does line up in the slot a majority of the time. Right now, 378 yards he's given up and 4 touchdowns in that slot area. So could be upside there. And I want to ask you, if not Allen Robinson, if maybe his price point is maybe a little bit too steep for you, knowing how vulnerable this pass defense is, could you go off to anyone else, maybe say an Anthony Miller or anyone else of this wide receiver core?
Yeah, it would only be Anthony Miller. We saw Anthony Miller's snaps slowly come up over the past month, and then this past week they dropped back down to like 50%, but he's a slot wide receiver, so it's not like he's just not playing as much because of him not playing well. It's just scheme. They ran a ton in that game. We talked about it earlier. David Montgomery had a huge game. So $3,700 Anthony Miller, yeah, that's a pretty sneaky, cheap wide receiver play on a slate where this week it seems like you do have some 4K options at wide receiver, but a lot of them have been priced up. So to have a 3K guy in Anthony Miller, who, if the game is not as dominant like it was last week in terms of just on the ground, which I don't expect against Philly, you probably see Anthony Miller get back up to around 70% of the snaps. And he did have 3 catches in this game on all of his targets, had a good game, even on limited snaps because of the run-heavy approach.
A few other guys here, Sal, in this 6K area. You got T.Y. Hilton, Beckham, Keenan Allen, McLaurin, Smith-Schuster, and Marvin Jones. And so I want to ask you, when you look at this pool of players here in the lower tier of the 6K price points, anyone stand out for you as far as price and matchup and point per dollar opportunity?
Yeah, so 2 players. Marvin Jones, we talked about earlier. Probably, I mean, the matchup definitely. Probably he'll get out there like a Trevion Mullen, and that's a really good spot for him. And also just stacking upside, he'll get into more lineups with Detroit. John Brown stands out. The price point is probably where it should be. He was on their price in the 5K range. He's seen the most targets out there in Buffalo, and now he has a really good matchup against Washington. It's just a matter of their 9.5-point favorites. How much do they need to throw the ball, especially deep? It'd probably be something where you need to see him pay it off in the first or second quarter with a deep play. And then, yeah, the 6K range outside of that, it's just a couple of guys that I have some interest in. Keenan Allen, I would love, at this price point, it hasn't moved. I would love to be rostering him, but it's a week where he probably faces Jair Alexander. And the only wide receivers that have given Alexander trouble are bigger wide receivers that also have speed, whereas Keenan Allen is, surely he has some height, but not as much of muscle behind him. So yeah, Keenan Allen, 6,400. If he shadowed or even followed into the slot by Alexander, which I expect, it's a really tough matchup. I'll have some interest, but not as much as I have the last couple of weeks. And then nothing else really stands out all that much. Juju in the slot against, like we were saying earlier, Indy wants to funnel to the middle of the field. So that helps Juju, that helps Vance McDonald, and it would help Jalen Samuels if he is indeed the starting running back. So Juju, some upside there. But in the 6K range, that's really it. I'm probably going to get to it a little bit, but mainly I'll be going up to the 7K range and then getting down to some value receivers.
Yeah, I think Juju Smith-Schuster might be in a really good spot here. It's like you said, they like to move everything to the middle of the field for the Colts. But I think also is the guys who are kind of line up inside as far as coverage is concerned, really have given up some big plays and given up production to slot wide receivers. So I think if you want to attack the Colts secondary. I think you want to attack like Rakia Sin or maybe Quincy Wilson. But I mean, outside of that, I think when I look at this wide receiver core as a first look, I think McLaurin is not in the best of matchups going into Buffalo. T.Y. Hilton could be somewhat interesting. But I think as we move down here now into like the 5K range, there seems to be a little bit of value. And one guy that kind of stands out that maybe is an area where if you want to pivot from Lockett is DK Metcalf. Big boomer bust guy. We saw last week, he had 5 targets, came down with 3 of them, 2 of them in the end zone, which helped pay off that low price point. But I mean, this is a game where we talked about earlier that we could see a Seattle heavy passing offense because of how stout this rush D is of the Bucs. So 5,700 for DK Metcalf. Is that somewhere you want to go?
So DK Metcalf, I tend to think even he is priced up this week like everybody else. But I mean, yeah, if you're talking about which player from these wide receivers, I'd choose DK over Lockett. And it's not just straight up. It's obviously factoring in price. And we already talked about the other 7K guys we like more. But DK, he's seen 11 red zone targets. All 11 of them have been in the end zone. So there's obvious upside there. Yeah, last week's a little bit skewed. Yeah, only 5 targets. They don't have to pass the ball a ton. He catches 3 of them. His 2 touchdowns were like both terrible blown defenses. Like if they were both jump balls, impressive, something to take away from it. But first one in the middle of the end zone, just nobody guards him. He's literally wide open. Second one in the back right corner, nobody guards him. I don't know how you let that guy get open twice. Now he has a really good matchup. If I was to choose a Seattle guy to really run back these Tampa Bay stacks with, it's hard to run it back with Lockett because he's 7K and so is the 2 Tampa Bay wide receivers. So I think it just naturally becomes maybe you pay for $7,200 Carson. But for me, I get a lot of crunches where Metcalf just fits in better because of his price. So that's probably where most of my ownership will come from, running it back as an option as a cheaper player. But even he, I think, is overpriced by like $300, $400, $500 on this slate. He's very touchdown dependent, as we've seen, and that's really how he's surviving so far this year.
When you look at this passing offense for Seattle, we obviously know Lockett lines up in the slot a lot. But on the outside, could you see big plays happening to DK Metcalf this week outside of these small little red zone targets that he gets?
Yeah, definitely. It's been nice to see like the last 2 games for them. He's being used a little bit differently, especially in the red zone, but he should be because there's a shorter field to work with. But being used across the middle of the field a little bit more on some of these shorter, just kind of curl routes or slants instead of going just straight down the field. But there is that upside that most of his routes will just be go routes against some weak Tampa Bay defenders. Like Tyler Lockett by far has the better matchup, by far has probably the better game here, but he's also priced like it for $2,000 more. He's the guy that is going to have the biggest advantage. You want to attack this team in the middle of the field. So that's great if you want to get to Lockett. It's just a matter of, do you really want to pay that top price point for him? So Metcalf being used in the middle of the field a little bit more the last 2 weeks gives me more confidence in really just the floor and ceiling combination for him in this matchup.
I remember when was it for the draft, his stock went down because they said that he can only run straight and nowhere else as far as his draft stock. But what we've seen lately is, like you said, they're kind of utilizing him differently now. He's running across the field. He's doing little slants. So, I mean, it seems as if that now they're also taking advantage of his size in the red zone, which it's really hard to have a man-on-man coverage on him with how big he is physically. I think when it comes to pounds, you always talk about guys and having weight. Having more weight than the opposing cornerback. And it's really a tough matchup when it comes to his physicality.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like that's a huge thing to look at. So like most weeks, like it helps jump ball receivers, which Metcalf probably lines up a little bit more as a jump ball receiver than anything else. And last week it's a little skewed. Like he didn't have to do anything in those red zone touchdowns in terms of jump balls. But yeah, if you have weight and size on a cornerback, you obviously have a better advantage if it plays to your skill set, which I think this one would. On the outside with some of these matchups against these undersized Bucs cornerbacks, and really anybody against him is going to be undersized. It's just a matter of separation. Like he's been getting decent separation on the outside when he goes deep. This team just doesn't throw it nearly enough for that to pay off as much. And that's like my main overall concern with this Seattle team this week is how much they need to throw. Yes, if Carson runs 15 times and is stonewalled every single time, sure, they'll throw it 35 times. If Carson has any bit of success against this defense, which is a big if, you probably see Russell Wilson throwing like 26 to 28 times.
One guy that I had a lot of high hope for when Devontae Adams went down, who I thought would take over that volume, was Valdez-Scantling. He's 5,600 going into Los Angeles this week. But I got to say, outside of that big game he had against Oakland, there really hasn't been anything there. And, this concerns me. And I don't think this is a good matchup for him per se this week as well. especially if Devontae Adams comes back. And so I want to ask you, given how I'm trying to look at this, but as a first look, is there any justification with going towards Scantling this week? Does maybe he benefit with Adams maybe coming back and not as much coverage being on him? Because I feel like when Adams went out, I feel like the primary defensive scheme was to make sure that they cover Valdez-Scantling. So I want to ask you, at 5,600, do you see yourself going this way?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to go there at all. Even if Adams is out, I'm not going to go there. MVS is a burner. He's a guy who runs down the field. He's taller than Deshaun Jackson, but he's this very same player. Like, he'll have a 40-yard reception per game. When he played Oakland, he played like only 20% of the snaps as he was injured. He caught a 40-yard catch, and then he catches just like a little 10-yard catch and takes it to the house because he has burners for about 74 yards or somewhere in that range. Though in terms of being a possession receiver, moving the chains, being consistent, there's no consistency in MVS. He's probably a number 3 wide receiver for most teams in this league, and that's nothing against his skill set. It's just the way that he is used, and his exact skills are to run just deep post routes, and he'll get open because he has speed. But other than like just moving the chains and being a consistent guy to get PPR targets for DraftKings or a 100-yard game from like 6 catches, it's not going to be there. He's overpriced at 5,600 by probably like $1,000+, honestly. Alan Lazard's only 3,900. If you want a Packers receiver and there's no Devontae Adams, it's Lazard. That's not me saying you should play him, because I don't think you should really play any of these Packers receivers. But he's 3,900. He's led the team in he's led the team in snaps the last 2 weeks at wide receiver, and last week he caught 5 balls. No other Packer receiver was even close to catching 5 balls. So he's 3,900. Yeah, no real interest in MVS. Quite honestly, he's just not a good possession receiver.
I want to ask you, these next 2 guys, this is kind of an area where I definitely want to attack this week, who I feel are priced appropriately and could see a lot of volume. But Robbie Anderson and Jamison Crowder going into Miami. You talked about Sam Darnold possibly being one of these guys at quarterback that you want to roster. So 5,500 and 5,300 are their price points. And I got to tell you, what we've seen is Miami just can't stop the pass. I mean, they just can't. We saw that last night again. Early on, they looked as if that they were going to come show up on Monday Night Football, but somehow, Rudolph was once again able to expose them. We saw a variety of touchdown passes from Rudolph. And I think, when it comes to the talent level of Sam Darnold and Rudolph, I think Sam Darnold definitely, gets that over the top of him. And so with Crowder and Anderson here, haven't seen as much targets that I would like to see to Crowder as compared maybe to early on in the season. But I got to tell you, with what we've talked about with Bell and how this offense is kind of shaky with the running game, do you have high expectations this week for these 2 guys?
So they're not like sky high. And if I played Darnold, I would probably stack him with these guys, but that's like a 4th stack option and not high volume on it, probably at best. But yeah, if I'm choosing them each as one-offs in the 5K range, I really like these guys. Anderson on the outside, no matter who he is, even if it's Xavier Howard for parts of the game, which I doubt it would be even if Howard is healthy, you have a really good matchup for Anderson on the outside. In the slot, Crowder's matchup doesn't get any better. The problem is with Crowder and GPPs, you need like 10 targets his way, which he can get this week, but as a 6-point favorite, it's really hard to see him having that sort of volume in the slot. But his matchup against Wilts in the slot will be one of the better ones for any slot receiver this week. So yeah, they have upside. My concern is just Anderson obviously has boom or bust upside. If he hits and he hits big, that's great. But you still need Crowder to see like 6 to 8 receptions, and that's a lot to ask for any slot wide receivers. So I prefer Anderson for GPPs, Crowder for cash.
Miami ranked dead last in defensive DVOA when it comes to the passing game. Almost doubled the next team in line, which is the Bengals. Miami at 35.5%, dead last in almost all pass defensive metrics across the board. So I mean, you gotta think these guys are priced cheaply. I don't mind going a couple shares, especially if you're multi-entering and looking at this New York Jets offense when it comes to the passing game, given the fact of this matchup. Couple guys down the list a little bit more. Now we're in the moving down towards more of these value plays. So I want to ask you, with the player pool that's down there and these guys that, obviously we look for guys to fit in our rosters for lineup construction, where do you see yourself going as far as value plays from the wide opposition?
Yeah, so it's not like last week where the 4K range was loaded with maybe like 10 viable-ish options for GPPs. But there are some decent options down here. A couple of guys that I have pointed out. Mike Williams, look, his big play upside has not been hitting for touchdowns. A lot of reason why is their offensive line has been terrible, not enough time. That could be a real issue this week once again against the Packers, and they're at home as underdogs, which is very good for a passing offense usually. As a home underdog, you're just going to pass more, and you're more comfortable at home. Mike Williams will benefit from probably not seeing much, if any, of Jair Alexander for the Packers. He is a smaller receiver or smaller cornerback, like we said earlier, who will probably be on Keenan Allen. Williams will get, if I had to guess, Kevin King, who's been very average at best, definitely beatable. So I like Mike Williams at 4,600. Both of the Miami wide receivers are down here. People, if they start to get chalky, just like last week with the Tennessee wide receivers, that weren't chalky, but they were higher on than they should have been, around 10%. You kind of just want to jump off of a bad offense if you're putting a lot of stock into them, and so are other people. But Devontae Parker and Preston Williams, $4,400 and $4,200. Both are in good spots. Devontae Parker is Fitzpatrick's favorite target. They're both getting a lot of air yards. I probably slightly prefer Devontae Parker, but both guys can be rostered. And then outside of that, there's really not much. Like we talked about Anthony Miller for 3,700, a really cheap value in a good spot whose snaps should be coming up. I think he'll be just unowned Anthony Miller. But if you're looking for a $3,700 wide receiver, he surely has way more upside than Alex Erickson does, who was the same price last week. So I like that a little bit. But then, yeah, just digging around this range as of right now on a first look, haven't really broken them down all that much. Those are some first look type of players. You still have the Tennessee receivers down there, and A.J. Brown and Corey Davis, just a tougher matchup now against Carolina's secondary.
Yeah, I don't see too many value plays this week as maybe compared to last week, as far as, guys who I think can get me there. So I think for wide opposition, I could see myself maybe going a little bit more in the upper mid-tier range, or even, paying up. I really think that there's some great plays this week, like both guys out of Tampa, who I think that you'll see a heavy passing offense from. You guys, as we go into tight end, I just want to thank everyone for joining us in here right now. And if you can, give us a thumbs up for everyone in here. Continue to support us, subscribe, so that way you guys can get notified for all the videos. A lot of great things happening today. We got the deeper dive later on. We got golf later on. A lot more NFL content as well. So if you guys want to make sure you're not missing out on anything and knowing when the schedule happens, click subscribe and make sure you like this, guys, so we guys can continue giving you guys this content day in and day out. Tight end, we're almost close here to the end, Sal. Looking at it early on, you got your few guys up at the top, and then it seems to be a little bit weak. But what's interesting this week on DraftKings is there's a gap, 6,000 to 4,700 when it comes to tight ends. There's no one in the 5K range. And so let me ask you, are you paying up this week at tight end, or can we go down like maybe last week with the Jonnu Smiths? And who else was the other guy that went off? I'm trying to remember. Oh, Ryan Griffin for the Jets. Where do you see yourself going this week with tight end?
Yeah, so I mean, DraftKings finally did it. All season long, we've had like no 6K, like one a week is 6K tight end. Now we have three. They're all up there, and then a huge drop off. So the way that the pricing is right now, it leads me to either get the Zach Ertz at 4,700, who should have Deshaun Jackson back. And I can't stress how much of importance that is. He's been double teamed at points in a lot of these games. Now he won't be against Chicago, who has not been that great against tight ends. They've been very middle of the pack at best. So like Zach Ertz at 4,700, probably on a Tuesday, which definitely can change, the guy I look to the most. $6,900 Travis Kelce. I don't want to pay top dollar for a guy whose ceiling is just so capped, and even his floor with Matt Moore. Darren Waller at 6,300 is fine if you want to get there. But we've already talked about how you have two very expensive running backs. You have a ton of expensive wide receivers. Like all the quality wide receivers in the 6K range, like we said earlier, are now in the 7K range, and some of them in the high 7K range. So like trying to pay up a tight end this week, it becomes very difficult if you want to pay up at any other spot, which I'm sure people want to do. So yeah, Zach Ertz 4,700. He's just way too cheap. I like that a lot. And then, yeah, there's a lot of punting options on this slate. Greg Olson's 3,500, running a lot of routes, still has not produced as of late, but lots of routes run. Not a great quarterback there with Kyle Allen, but he's upside for his price point. I think Noah Fant at $3,000 is your stereotypical quote-unquote punt. He could have 5 points for you, and people, when you're rostering him, you should really know that. But there's going to be maybe track Jeff Heuerman's status, but if he's out, Fant will be on the field for 80% of the snaps with a backup quarterback. Terrible overall ceiling spot, but if you're trying to get 5 or 6 receptions out of a very cheap tight end, that seems like a good spot if all the cards go his way. Outside of that, Jonnu Smith, he's fine if Delaney Walker's out again at his price point. If you want to get there, you're trusting Ryan Tannehill in really a one-game sample of Smith with him. Vance McDonald, 4,100 against Indy. They funnel to tight ends, running backs, and slot receivers, like we've said, for all the other spots. So he'll probably be unowned, and he's in a decent spot. Yeah, I tend to just pay for Zach Ertz at 4,700. I think it's just a misprice on that spot with Deshaun Jackson back, or maybe just punt the position. And for the most part this year, I haven't really punted the position, but it just makes it tough when these guys are all very expensive.
Little thing, Jets are looking to trade Le'Veon Bell before the 4 p.m. deadline, and people are saying that he's going to the Chiefs. Is that correct?
I would say no, but I haven't looked at Twitter this whole stream, so we're either getting trolled real hard, or the Jets are about to just like troll the entire league by sending him there.
Yeah.
But I'll look it up, but I don't think so.
All right. And I want to talk about something real quick.
Le'Veon Bell now available 15 minutes ago, but that's all they've said. A trade deadline could be traded. No talks to the Chiefs I'm seeing right now, but looking to deal him within the next 2 hours is what this says. That's just insane.
One guy I want to talk about real quick. He's priced at 4,700 is Zach Ertz. And I want to ask you, what has gone on this year with Zach Ertz in the passing offense with what we saw last year and his connection with Wentz, and now seeing it completely just, transform into nothing?
Yeah, so I think pretty much. Sorry, can you repeat that just real quickly?
Yeah. I was talking about Zach Ertz and this year being complete 180 from last year. And I wanted to ask you, do you know what's going on as far as his passing game in the tight end position for the Eagles?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is, and sorry, I was reading like the actual report on Bell,
Oh,
but
that's fine.
the main thing with Ertz is just really Deshaun Jackson being out. That's it. Like you replaced Deshaun Jackson, who was having a lot of success the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season before he got hurt, with Matt Collins, who literally has not caught a ball the last month of the season and no separation. What the whole entire passing offense is doing is it's restricting to a narrower offense. You have Alshon Jeffrey, who's not a deep target anymore. He's going to be the short intermediate range. Zach Ertz, short and intermediate for the most part. Can go downfield, but not as much. So what defenses are doing are, we're not scared of Matt Collins. We don't even have to put safety help that side of the field. We're going to put more safety help to the middle of the field to restrict Zach Ertz. And at points, we're just going to double team him with a linebacker and a safety. And that's what's happening. So it's really hurt Zach Ertz' upside. But if Deshaun Jackson, and they said he's expected to be practicing this week and play for week 9, if that's the case, the first 3 weeks of the season where Deshaun Jackson opened the field up more will come back. And Zach Ertz's single coverage and how it should be for a tight end will also come back. So yeah, his price point is probably like $1,000 too cheap if that happens. And on a week where all the other tight ends are priced up, I like it. I will say out of the 6K tight ends, I probably like Hunter Henry the best this week. Green Bay has struggled with versatile tight ends.
So that was leading me into my question, because I felt like at 4,700, he's completely underpriced for the level of talent that we know that he can produce. And so I wanted to ask you, I mean, if you had to choose and you have Zach Ertz here at 4,700, and you can save and take a gamble on someone who, no matter what, he has a talent. And if they're doubling him on every play, okay, well, I mean, there's still that opportunity for him to break out. And so I want to ask you, 4,700, or do you pay down for Jimmy Graham or McDonald or Delaney Walker? I think the no-brainer is at Zach Ertz at 4,700. You kind of have to really take a look into this a little bit more.
Yeah, if I had to guess right now, he'd probably be my highest owned tight end. We'll see where ownership comes in. I would guess he'd probably be the highest owned tight end. Maybe people will buy into Jonnu Smith's one good game or a couple good games, but really the one that stood out last week. But yeah, Zach Ertz at 4,700. Right now, he's my number one tight end, and I don't think that'll change too much. And if Deshaun Jackson's in, I think it's the optimal way to go based on how expensive a lot of wide receivers are.
If Zach Ertz is your number one tight end, where would you say the mix of the next 2 or 3 guys come from? As far as, are you going up and paying up, or are you paying down? And if you are, where are you going to?
Yeah, so right now I'd probably go up to Hunter Henry if I could afford it. It'll be very lineup construction based, but that's where I would want to go, at least if I had to say right now without like crunching anything. So it'd be Ertz and then Hunter Henry, a little bit cheaper than Waller. Also think he has a really good matchup. Waller's matchup is fine as well. If you wanted to get there, he'd honestly probably be third. But if I was trying to talk about guys that are below the price point of Ertz and some of the priorities, yeah, I do like Greg Olsen, the amount that he's been on the field. And then I honestly, if Jeff Heuerman is out for Denver, I'll probably punt in spots with Noah Fant at $3,000, and he will stay in the field for about 80% of the game. With a backup quarterback is terrible, but really at $3,000, if you're punting tight end and you get 5 catches for like 50 yards, you take it.
Any type of, I guess, interest in Jonnu Smith, who a lot of people talked about this past week, I saw in chat, and then also Ryan Griffin, who we saw kind of broke out this past game with 2 touchdowns. Definitely, it looked like he had some speed too, man. I don't know if you saw, but on the 1 touchdown that he scored, he seemed to just break away from the entire secondary. So I wanted to ask you, if we think that this offense is going to be pass heavy, and I'll tell you, if Bell is gone and they trade him away, I think that they will rely on this passing offense to put them in a position to win. Any love for Ryan Griffin against a really weak Miami pass defense?
Yeah, so we gotta see what happens with Chris Herndon. He came into last week doubtful. If he practices this week, then he had no interest in Ryan Griffin. Ryan Griffin primarily has been running routes, but just not seeing any targets before last week. And really, I mean, limited targets last week. He just ends up getting in the end zone. So it's a spot that I probably don't go back to, even if Bell is gone. If Herndon is in, I would have interest in Herndon. as a guy who then becomes even more of a priority at $4,000 against Miami. So that's actually a spot we should probably track. Doubtful last week. If he practices this week, $4,000 Chris Herndon would probably be my next favorite option after Ertz if you're looking for cheaper tight ends, if indeed he's going to be a full go against Miami.
And at a first look, last week we saw a couple guys in the high 2,000 range at tight end go off. And so I want to ask you, if you had to pick one guy that is a very low price tight end with any upside, you mentioned Noah Fant. Is that the guy, or do you see anywhere else?
Yeah, it would be Noah Fant for me. The only other player that I think is interesting, but like I'm not going to roster them, don't recommend it. But moving forward, Tyler Kroft came back for his first game for Buffalo. He's 2,600. He ran 20 routes his first game back. He played more snaps than Dawson Knox, but Knox still ran 21 routes. I think that changes. I think that you see Tyler Kroft take back over as the guy from the Bengals that they acquired and run more routes than Knox, who's been good, but I mean, he hasn't been very productive. He's just had a couple of crazy stiff arms. So that's 2,600. I don't think there's much upside there. I think you get at best like a 3 to 4 catch day for minimal yardage. I'd rather go to Font, who I still don't think is going to be owned. And if Hiraman is out, there's just a pretty decent floor. It's not great because you're paying $3,000 for a tight end with a backup quarterback, but in that range, that's probably where I go the most.
I guess my theory is with Font is when you have a backup quarterback come in, a lot of the times he uses that security blanket and that safety net, and that's usually the tight end position. And so I could see Brandon Allen this week. I mean, we really don't know his level of talent, but I could definitely see him coming in and in past opportunities, checking down and really hitting his tight end and constructing plays to make it easy for him and the offense. So I don't mind that at 3,000. The only thing I would like to see is for Font to get in the end zone. I think that's the only thing that's lacking right now. 8 targets last week, 5 before that, but only one time have we seen him score this year. And I think that if he can get in the end zone and get some nice looks from this backup quarterback, I think he's in line for 3K. I don't mind it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what you said about like the backup quarterback being in helps him the most. Like taking deep shots to Cortland Sutton isn't really an option. No Emmanuel Sanders, so Fred Brown on the outside isn't really going to help your backup quarterback all that much. I think that it might be a little bit more of Deshaun Hamilton, although I don't want to play him in DFS out of the slot. And then the most part, Font, who, we're not trying to say that he's going to score 20 points here, but if you get 10 points out of a 3K tight end, especially on this sort of a slate, I think you like that. And I think there's definitely upside for that and more if he gets in the end zone.
Shane in chat said Irv Smith Jr. ? For the tight end position.
Yeah, so I actually like Irv Smith Jr. He played on his most snaps that he's ever played on in that last game, and he's looked good. He's constantly going to get you like 3 catches or so for maybe 30 yards. So, I mean, if you just want to completely punt that position for $2,700, more times than not, you're probably looking at like 5 to 6 fantasy points. So I, again, would rather just go up to Font. He's running and splitting his snaps, and a lot of the time they're both on the field at the same time with Kyle Rudolph. But once again, it's just a similar situation where I'd rather just get the Dalvin Cook on that offense over just a cheap punt tight end. I think you're better off just punting Noah Fant or maybe Irv Smith is like your next best option after that. But it's really just Noah Fant if I'm going to go down.
Looking at kind of where we're at this week for tight end, is it kind of a no-brainer that you're going to want to roster one of these top guys rather than paying down?
So I don't know if it's a no-brainer as much. I think like Zach Ertz would be like in the no-brainer category as just like a salary relief type of tight end with huge upside. Like we know this guy's 30-point upside and should be an easier matchup if Jackson is back. I think like the issue with paying up for, say, $6,300 Waller, he surely can pay that off. And we've seen him score touchdowns 3 in the last 2 weeks. Like he has the upside. It's just a matter of when you start looking across different positions, you want to pay up for one of those top end running backs. Okay, well, that's expensive. You want to pay up for any quality wide receiver, you're going to be paying like $6,500 plus for 2 of them. So prioritizing your lineups around the tight end this week doesn't seem like the smartest move as of Tuesday. It makes more sense to kind of prioritize around the top end wide receivers and running back. So I think more times than not, I'll land on Zach Ertz, maybe Hunter Henry, but I'll probably be in that low to mid range for the most part.
All right, we're going to go into defense, guys. And as we're coming here to an end, I will say, for those of you who have not signed up yet with Osmo.com, if you want to check out a pretty cool page where they kind of break everything down before you get involved to know exactly what you're getting, go to Osmo.com/join. It's a cool little NFL page and a nice little features page where you can watch videos and really see like what the lineup builder is, the top stacks tool. the ownership projections, the player projections, all these different tools and resources we use here at Awesemo.com, created and developed by the number one player in the world himself, Alex Baker, aka Awesemo. And if you do want to sign up, get 50% off your first month and use the promo code NFL Strategy. Okay, guys, we just did tight end. We're gonna now finish off with defense. I guess Sal, let's just go into it. I mean, defenses for me is kind of, I like to spread it out. I like to kind of have a different type of variety of defenses with my lineups that I construct, especially when I'm multi-entering. So any specific defenses this week just standing out to you?
Yeah, so I completely agree. Like, never prioritize a defense. I mean, I know people want to prioritize the Patriots defenses. Maybe that makes sense on like showdown slates, but I don't really want to prioritize a defense ever. But yeah, the spot that I look to is teams that can generate pressure. And if they're at home, it's even better. So I usually try and pay down at defense, $3,000 or below. There's 4 spots that stand out early that I'm looking at so far this week. It's the Eagles at home against Mitch Trubisky. That sounds great at $3,000. It's the Denver Broncos at home who can generate pressure against a bad offensive line in Cleveland, $2,900. That sounds good. Carolina at home that can generate pressure against Ryan Tannehill. Sounds good at $2,800. And then the last one, they've been mispriced a couple of times this year, but the Steelers defense at home against Jacoby Brissett, the guy hasn't been making mistakes, and a lot of that's credited to Frank Wright and that coaching staff. But he hasn't been making mistakes. But $2,400 for the Steelers defense at home against Brissett, who for the most part probably doesn't dominate you more times than he makes mistakes. So those are 4 defenses. Again, I like to prioritize guys at home. And if anybody has a pass rush, I like it. So the ones that really stand out are probably Philadelphia at $3,000 and Denver at $2,900.
I think what you just mentioned in the Pittsburgh Steelers D at 2,400, I could really see myself going there a lot. And one, because they're a defense that forces turnovers. They seem to be problematic for opposing offenses on a week-to-week basis. If you look at the last 5 weeks, I mean, they've scored in double-digit points as far as fantasy points are concerned, but they have forced 4 turnovers, 3 turnovers, 3 turnovers, 5 turnovers, and they're getting sacks too. So they're applying pressure and they're limiting their opponents. The last, I think it's 4 or 5. I think it's 4 of the last 3 weeks held their opponents from 17 points or under. And this is a defense where at 2,400, and I will say, I mean, nothing bad to say about the Colts, but I think coming into Pittsburgh is going to put a real stressful environment on Jacoby Brissett and this offense, I think. And at 2,400, if they're able to force some turnovers and essentially put themselves in line to win, I could definitely see myself going there a lot.
Yeah, I mean, let's just look at it this way. Right now, according to Pro Football Focus, the Steelers have the number 1 pressure rate defense in the entire league. Number 1. So even if you're not going to make mistakes in Brissett, when you're on the road in Pittsburgh, getting colder there, facing this sort of a pass rush, it's tough. Like, yeah, if I open this salaries up, I would have expected the Steelers to be like a top 5 price defense this week, above 3,000. So them being 2,400, it's just a spot where you never want to like 100% of defense because, yeah, if they go for 2 points, you're just screwed. You want to have that sort of a variant position spread out. But if I'm hand building 3 maxes, single entries, and not using Fantasy Cruncher, it's going to be really hard to not just plug in a cheap defense where usually you're hoping for like 5 points. But against the Steelers, that's almost like their floor with the pass rush and the pressure that they create.
Yeah, I think I really like that call with the Steelers defense. And then outside of that, I think what I'll do is I'll just probably have it spread around. I like to limit my pools to about 7 or 8 defenses I think are in good spots. But outside of that, Sal, that's it for this first look, guys. And I want to ask you, is there anything that you want to mention before we go ahead and end this show?
No, I think that's it. I think that like the overall premise as we were just kind of going through it and realizing it even more is like if Jalen Samuels doesn't open up this week, I don't even know how you build a lineup that you feel comfortable about. There's just you're going to have to take risks in spot because just everybody's priced up. Even with Samuels at 4,000, it'll help you out a ton. But DraftKings, like they really just this week, whatever their algorithm is doing, every position is priced up, it seems. And there's some value at running back that we're going to maybe get lucky with. But yeah, as the week goes on, I'll be here Thursday and Saturday at 11 a.m., Saturday with Chris, Thursday with Lofty. So definitely be sure to check that out. We'll see how sort of the process and some of these injuries change.
I want to ask you with Jalen Samuels, I mean, he was inactive for this previous game. And so as far as health is concerned, let's just say he's not able to go. And if Snell is injured as well, where do they go with this running game?
Yeah, so I actually was going to bring that up. Like, this would be a first time ever, I think, in DFS that, like, maybe not ever, but Trey Edmonds, if Snell's injured, if Connor's injured, if Samuels misses, Trey Edmonds, who played in the preseason, played well, would be the starting running back. I don't expect him to just get all the carries, though. I think that for the most part, after that, you probably see like 2 or 3 guys splitting up a lot of the workload. They're not going to have just one running back active, but Edmonds would probably be the lead horse there at 3K. Definitely be valuable. I think, though, it'd be very slim. You'd have to see Jalen Samuels really tweak his injury in practice this week. Look, if Connor is out, and that's what we're expecting, and Snell is out, and that's just what we're going to assume for this situation, then there's just even added pressure to get Jalen Samuel back. And Jalen Samuel was practicing in full before Monday night's game. I think they just said, we're playing the Miami Dolphins. We can get by this week without you. Take a seat. And that's what happened there. So he practiced in full. I think he'll be fine this week unless he re-aggravates something in practice. We should be good to go on him. We're just really hoping now that he opens, or that value opens up in him. We'll see what happens with James Conner. Doesn't look good early on.
So Le'Veon Bell just went to the Patriots.
Wait, is that actually true, or is that just like what chat was saying?
I think it's true from what I'm seeing right now. I don't know. I think they could be trolling, but I just saw some beat reporters write about it, so I'm not too sure. But I think it could be real. I'm trying to figure out right now. If anything, I mean, it's pretty wild if it's true.
Yeah, I'm open. I'm just still seeing open.
It's not real.
Guys, don't troll us right now, man, because it's like I can't pay attention because I'm doing this, and then I see that, and I'm like, all right, and then I look at these beat reporters, and I don't know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, that's what I figured. That's probably the same thing that the person in the chat saw.
Well, guys, listen, I guess we'll close that out because I need to go ahead and look into this a little bit more. But, once again, thank you all for joining us, and we appreciate it. If you can, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, like this. Don't forget the promo code NFL Strategy if you're looking to sign up with awesemo.com. Once again, Sal Vitri, it was always a pleasure. Where can we find you outside of doing these live shows on a week-to-week basis?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Sal Vetri DFS, and then just my YouTube channel is just Sal Vetri, just some more fantasy content over there. And then, like Chris said, I'll be here on the Awesemo channel. I'll be Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 11 a.m. for NFL. And then actually tomorrow with Josh, I will be on at 9:30 for the NBA. We got a big slate, so if you want to check that out.
All right, guys. Chris Randone on Twitter. Once again, we appreciate all of you. Have a great day, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care.